And I'm going to begin by congratulating all of you for appearing here on an evening which is wet and rather chilly, and I'm sure it must have been tempting to stay home by the fire and be cozy. Thank you very much, Maxine, for that introduction. The other thing I would like to check is the level of sound. I understand that some of you are having difficulty hearing me, and the people in the sound studio up above have assured me that they've cranked this machine up. It's supposed to be at maximum volume. Is it possible for you to hear? I see people in the back row nodding, so thank you very much. Well, as Maxine has just said, the topic for this evening that I've chosen is developing a Christian worldview in post-secondary education. In the first of this series of lectures on the church in post-secondary education, I described a tendency in Canada today towards the view that the post-secondary education system is the prime means of improving the economy overall and of increasing personal benefit lifelong. Thus, the trend towards increased emphasis in institutions of post-secondary education on selected fields of knowledge and on the development of particular skills that are deemed to contribute most directly and immediately to the fulfillment of those expectations has gained momentum and enjoys fairly widespread public support. In the second lecture, I turned to a consideration of the notion that the well-educated person has an understanding and an appreciation of different ways of knowing, organized according to particular aspects of human knowledge or experience, including religion, and I argued that the study of religion has a necessary place in the curriculum of post-secondary education. I suggested, too, that whether or not religious studies are recognized and offered formally as courses or programs, the presence of committed Christians within institutions of post-secondary education as teachers, scholars, and researchers can bring Christian ideas and perspectives to bear in every realm of thinking. In this, the third lecture of the series, I want to address the idea of what it means to develop a worldview consistent with the knowledge of God revealed through Jesus Christ, and how such a worldview can inform scholarship, teaching, and policy in post-secondary education. Now, for those of you who were present at the talkback session this afternoon, I would like to congratulate you on your ability to anticipate some of the things I'm going to say tonight, because the questions that you raised at that time certainly did just that. And for those of you who haven't been able to join us in the talkback sessions, I would like to pay tribute to the people who are there and say to you who have not been with us that it's proven to me to be a most lively and helpful part of this lecture series. A number of years ago, I came across a book that may be familiar to many of you. It's written by Harry Blamires, and it's entitled The Christian Mind. That title caught my attention immediately. Here was someone who had evidently dealt with kinds of questions I had begun to ask myself first as an undergraduate, and later as I continued through graduate studies and into a career as a teacher, professor, and administrator. My personal search continues. But Blamires and other thoughtful Christians who share such concerns and have written about them have been very helpful to me. They challenge me to a sharper awareness of the importance of bringing a Christian mind or worldview to everything I do. Jesus does that, too. He persists in showing people over and over again that the way we human beings think about God, about our neighbors, about ourselves, about the way we live, and about the world we live in matters a great deal. You'll recall his conversation with the scholar Nicodemus in John chapter 3. Frequently, he reminded scholars like Nicodemus, as he reminds us through the recorded word, that we are looking at things incorrectly. We have too limited a vision. We do not take into account the fact that God acts outside of and beyond mere human experience. We forget that our ways of thinking have been misdirected, skewed by disobedience to God's laws and by dependence on human ideas or on the knowledge that comes only through our own senses. In John chapter 7, verse 24, Jesus says, quite directly, "Stop judging by mere appearance and make a right judgment." How then can we develop and adopt a way of thinking consistent with Christian belief, which will help to distinguish among the assumptions and presuppositions that are inconsistent with Christian thought, that we are in danger of taking for granted because of their very pervasiveness in the modern world? Last night, I pointed out that all systems of human knowledge begin with the belief that something is the case or could be the case. Once sufficient evidence has been aggregated and judged to be valid, then the claim for knowledge is put to the test of reality in human experience or in the physical world. The first important way of assessing such a claim is to be clear about the assumptions and presuppositions on which it rests. Then we can test whatever claims for knowledge and action are being made to see whether they are consistent with those underlying assumptions and evaluate them accordingly. It seems to me that a Christian commitment means that the scholar acknowledges that all truth ultimately comes from God. At the same time, the tenets of disciplined scholarship demand that the Christian scholar avoid superstition and fanaticism. Both commitments are necessary. In the preface to his book, Christ and the Modern Mind, Robert Smith illustrated the nature of the Christian scholar's task with a reference to the traditional teaching of the Jewish rabbis. These rabbis held that ignorance and piety face opposite directions in life and pursue contrary goals. The uninformed person cannot understand what God has done in countless ways and ages. Fools argue for a non-theistic basis of knowledge, primarily because they are unmoved to look deeply into learning and creation. Moreover, it is clear that the way we know has powerful implications for the way we live. Modes of knowing become ways of living. Parker J. Palmer expressed the idea this way: every mode of knowing contains its own moral trajectory, its own ethical direction and outcomes. And I expect most of us are pretty aware of the fact that that is going to be demonstrated on this campus tomorrow evening in a very extreme case. Every scholar begins with a particular approach to a discipline. No scholar can claim to be unbiased, whether in the humanities, the social sciences, or the natural sciences. Robert Smith, that I referred to earlier, used a striking metaphor to describe this process. It's one that I remind myself frequently. Each scholar, each of us, knots the thread before sewing the fabric of learning in our discipline. So it is vital to be clear about the starting points we use in our thinking. Believing that the universe is God's handiwork, that human beings are important to God, and that God wants to relate to each of us through the love of Christ, is critical to the roles Christians fulfill, whether it be as scholars in post-secondary education or as citizens of Canada and of the world, as individuals, as members of families, as people in relationship with others. A worldview grounded in these assumptions is comprehensive, is explanatory, and has reliably demonstrated its potency for people in different places and at different times in history. Such a worldview quite literally makes sense for us. It gives meaning to phenomena, to events, and to our own experience. But a word of caution: it does not provide answers to problems. Rather, it is a way of framing the questions we ask as we seek to resolve those problems. By speaking about the development of a Christian worldview, I am addressing the necessity of forming a comprehensive framework of basic beliefs about things. These beliefs are basic, because they deal with ultimate questions, general principles, moral issues. They are the presuppositions that form the beginning of a cognitive claim to knowledge which can be defended and shared. They have to do with the world, with human life, with the meaning of suffering, with the value of education, with social morality, with God, so on. As each of us constructs a framework of our beliefs, a framework that has coherence and consistency, we acquire a worldview. It was Albert Walters who reminds us, it is because we believe human beings have been created with a sense of responsibility that we cannot accept purely arbitrary opinions or make unprincipled decisions. Human beings can and do make choices among different worldviews. When we make those choices as scholars and as a society, we shape our existence through that way of thinking about life and the world. And recent history in Nazi Germany, in Stalinist Russia, Gandhi in India, apartheid policies in South Africa are all examples of the way worldviews of various sorts shape what happens. I will turn now to a consideration of several components of a Christian worldview which seem particularly germane to the task of thinking about scholarship, teaching, and policy in post-secondary education. I've selected 7 components or facets of a worldview to share with you tonight. I don't intend that this give you the impression that I think these are the only facets or even perhaps ultimately the most important ones, but they're ones that make sense to me and I've found important. So let me share these 7 with you. First of all, the component of understanding in the academic disciplines. While I've already alluded to the role of belief in the process of making claims for knowledge in any field of study, I've not dealt directly to this point with the importance of being able to sort out competing claims or of being able to distinguish between what is important or what is less important among them. Someone asked that question this afternoon. The conscious, careful scrutiny of claims to knowledge from a Christian perspective should result in an ability to balance the value we place on the life of the intellect or aesthetic activity with a sense of what is of even greater worth. C.S. Lewis made the point that Christian scholars who believe that people are immortal beings will have a very different set of priorities than those scholars who do not. And he applied that to his own field of literature, that once he became a Christian and began to see that there were very, very important issues in life that he had to confront and deal with as a Christian, he began to see that although his work in scholarship as in literature was important, it wasn't as important. Notions about justice in the law, about respect for life, and about human responsibility for the consequences of our decisions, which are consistent with a Christian worldview, will prevent us from hiding behind false notions of objectivity or of detachment, or of claiming immunity from blame for the effects of our thinking on the kinds of actions that follow. I would refer again to the quotation that I used last night from the Vienna Declaration of the scientists who met last year to assume their responsibility for what happens to the kind of knowledge that they are generating in this day. Persons are factors in the process of discovery. They do influence its course, and the Christian should be able to raise then the telling question, and depending on the answers available, may have to argue for alternative, from the perspective of a Christian worldview, alternative ideas and act accordingly. The second component I would suggest is critical rationality. The capacity to ask the telling question is always central to the kinds of research we undertake in post-secondary education and to the tests we put to the evidence when it is presented. We all know that there are many, many questions to be asked, and among all those many questions to be asked, which ones do we select to address? Which ones do we select to devote sometimes our whole lives to finding an answer? A worldview based on belief in a rational, intentional, personal God provides a set of assumptions that enable the Christian scholar to question the values assumed in various theories. A consistent worldview is basic, then, to the recognition of the strengths and the limitations of theories, whether they are employed by the economist, the psychologist, the scientist, the historian, the poet, or the artist. It is helpful to remind ourselves that satisfying explanations, like every other form of human endeavor, are subject to the whims of fashion. It is the task of the Christian scholar to discern when modern thought is subverting biblical thinking and when it is providing new tools for explanation that transcends our cultural limitations. A third component, moral autonomy. The context for decision-making within the framework of the Christian worldview rests on the assumption that we are responsible for the consequences of decisions made with respect to others and with respect to our own behavior. We believe that God supplies the strength to sustain the kind of moral autonomy expected of us personally and collectively. As Christians, we acknowledge, again I repeat this, that every mode of knowing contains its own moral trajectory, its own ethical direction and outcomes. And as Palmer expressed it, and as I've just repeated, we are therefore obligated to develop modes of knowing that recognize the relational nature of reality, wholeness in human life, and an appreciation of the world that has been given to us. The fourth component, self-awareness. A Christian worldview provides a balanced sense of personal and intellectual existence. We see God as person, creator, and sustainer of life. We see ourselves as finite persons who have been created with a need for a relation to God, as persons who have acted in ways that have estranged us from our Creator. We believe that God entered the historical process in the person of Jesus Christ to restore finite persons to himself. By extending this Christian interpretive scheme to every area of human experience, we can show how it relates to literary experience, present historical processes, and human culture in the largest sense. Such a worldview should enable the Christian to deal with all facets of lived experience, to answer questions of personal existence, and to test its claims with honesty and integrity. The dilemmas of the human condition are not to be ignored. Pain, death, suffering remain unresolved tensions, but the experience of God in one's life offers hope and gives meaning and strength. The fifth component, vocational orientation. A Christian worldview will affect, I believe, the way we fulfill our academic and professional responsibilities and our attitudes toward them. I speak now as a person within the Academy, as a professional who's been in universities. I believe that in addition to the sense of personal integrity such a worldview endeavors, there is a mandate to be of service to others. The Christian is called to emulate our Lord, who willingly stooped in life to serve his own followers, who reminded them and us that he came not to be served, but to serve. The Christian worldview opens our eyes to responsibility for service to others and to a much larger appreciation of the worth of others. We are called to the task of overcoming oppression, racism, and sexism in all of their forms wherever they exist. But I think primarily I'm concerned about that notion of what it means to serve. The sixth component I've selected is political awareness. It's very timely when I wrote this, I really didn't know that we would be in the midst of a federal election. A Christian worldview, by definition, must encompass a concern and a responsibility for devising the kind of government that upholds our assumptions about the worth of people and the worth of the world God has created. Prophets, psalmists, our Lord himself decried the injustices that exist at the local, national, and international levels. The Christian cannot substitute personal faithfulness for social responsibility. The Christian must retain, in my view, the kind of personal moral judgment and independence which motivate actions to abolish and to eliminate poverty and hunger and weapons of mass destruction, to protect against unjust structures in society, and to set aside the madness that seeks supremacy and world dominance. And the seventh component, aesthetic and cultural awareness. Just as a well-developed Christian worldview accounts for the very preservation of life on earth, so it must account for the quality of life on earth. Every human being demonstrates hunger for food, water, and aesthetic delight. According to art educator Pauline Johnson, the hunger for lasting values feeds inner needs as food feeds physical needs. In the realm of the aesthetic, the visual arts, as an example, are meant to provide for the human need for beauty in all forms of our existence. Aesthetic awareness is associated with the creativity, intuition, and imagination with which humans have been endowed, along with the logic of reason. They are qualities that are present in all human activity, including other intellectual pursuits. They serve the function of reminding us that the world is not solely the domain of theoretical thought, and that the images we hold of ourselves shape our actions in the same powerful way that other modes of thinking do. In a culture that values the utilitarian, the Christian declares that whatever is beautiful, whether it is a tree or a sonata, has worth in itself because a creative God has conferred the capacity for artistry on his human creatures. And I'm indebted to Ryken for that thought. Artistic life is but one aspect of the particular cultural life in which each of us is situated, that in its totality is rooted in a dominant worldview. In Canada, we are committed to an appreciation of cultural diversity, and we become culturally aware when we begin to understand that each culture has its own worldview, its own universe of language and understanding and ways of knowing and ways of behaving. The Christian worldview is cross-cultured. It rests on the presupposition that people are created in the image of God and that no one is excluded from God's grace, and on the commandment that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. To summarize thus far, I've tried to demonstrate that the development of a distinctively Christian worldview is critically important. In the arena of ideas in post-secondary education, the ability to assess the claims of conflicting theories and concepts and to be able to address them rigorously rests on a clear understanding of a set of beliefs based on God's revelation of reality, as, for example, in 2 Timothy 3, verses 16 and 17. On this basis, the Christian teacher and scholar can offer a searching critique of contemporary thought and can devise alternative explanations consistent with the priorities characteristic of a Christian worldview. For the Christian in every age, it is imperative that the logic of the day not be placed above the inner logic of divine revelation. It is a matter of putting our scholarship, our culture, as best we can, and the whole of humanity into the perspective of God's point of view, not into the perspectives that are limited by human experience and understanding only. God offers us a much broader view of human life, of what it can and of what it should be. This view is to be found in the Scripture and in our relationship with God's Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. In fact, the notion of a Christian worldview is very close to a definition of a theology I came across recently that really appeals to me. Theology is described at its best as a prayerful reflection on the heart's knowledge of God's presence in our lives. I'd like to repeat that. Theology at its best is a prayerful reflection on the heart's knowledge of God's presence in our lives and how we share that with others. To this point, I've spent a fair amount of time considering some important ways that a well-developed Christian worldview should contribute to scholarship in post-secondary education. Now I would like to turn briefly to consideration of some of the ways a Christian worldview can enhance the nature of teaching in post-secondary education. I don't for a moment think that scholarship and teaching are divorced or should be separated. However, I know that all of my colleagues in post-secondary institutions know that we do make arbitrary kinds of distinctions between research and scholarly work and teaching. And I'm very conscious of the fact that sometimes we are concerned about the relative weight put on that and the way in which it's recognized in our institutions. I'll be alluding to that. If teaching practice is to be appropriate to the kinds of knowledge included in the curriculum of post-secondary education, then professors must ensure that students understand the process by which knowledge claims are made and accepted by the community of scholars and researchers in the disciplines or fields of study. I've commented on that. I do repeat it again because I think that's so important. It's just honest, but it's also extremely important in terms of what we do in universities. At a minimum, this requires that we as professors and students undertake a careful examination of the sets of assumptions underlying current thinking in the discipline or field of study being taught, or at least those that are being taught in a particular class. It also requires that students be afforded an opportunity to examine these assumptions critically and to learn how to question them in a responsible manner. Dr. McCrae gave us a very good example of that in his comment about his history professor the other night and how he said that he was going to be prejudiced, but then explained what his prejudices were and made it clear that students would be expected to criticize those along with other ideas. Now, I think it's very difficult for students to do this well. Certainly, I, as an undergraduate student, found that I had no guidance in how to do it. Perhaps it was because of the time at which I was an undergraduate student and the fact that professors weren't quite as conscious of this and didn't lead us through this. I suspect in my conversations with the people here in the Divinity College and on campus generally that people are now much more open and much more conscious of the necessity of doing this, and that this is part of class work. However, I wouldn't be prepared to say that it's a universal habit or practice, and so I think it is important to make the point that we do have to give our students opportunity to examine assumptions critically, to learn how to question them in a responsible way. It's difficult for students to do this well until they have some idea of some of the other possibilities that might exist, or until they've reached a level of mastery which permits them to devise their own tentative suppositions as a first step toward the development of a new explanation or of a new understanding or of an existing concept that they want to criticize and put up against for comparison and for study. So it's critically important, therefore, that Christian academics must be first-rate scholars in their respective fields and able to do this for their students and to disseminate that through writing and publication so that others will be able to understand that. And I'm most grateful, as I said earlier, to Christian scholars who have done that and have made me aware of these things. I'm in their debt. Professors and students who bring a Christian worldview to bear on the problems being explored in class will often be able to present illuminating ways of viewing the data, the phenomena, or the concepts under study. Thoughtful challenges to taken for granted ideas is the very stuff of lively classroom debate and leads on a path of discovery. It is the key to growth in understanding on the part of students and professors alike. All of us are so pleased when we have that kind of lively interaction in our classes, and it gives us all the kind of stimulus which develops our thinking. The claims of a Christian worldview should also extend beyond the intellectual enjoyment of ideas into an examination of the effects these ideas might have on human life and action, the kind of thing that requires reflection and thoughtfulness. And again, someone raised that in one of our discussion periods, and I appreciated that very much. Despite the predominance of ways of thinking based on the belief that human beings can achieve anything, and that is a very predominant view held by many, given time and adequate resources to do so. That belief is one that surely we have to challenge. It must therefore be our role to represent God's claims in the face of such claims in ways that permit fair consideration in the classroom and in the laboratory. Now, good teaching in post-secondary education, or at any level of education for that matter, is always a memorable experience for the students who enjoy its benefits. Stories and accounts of the practices and the idiosyncrasies of outstanding professors are legendary and become the currency at every alumni reunion. But when teaching at the post-secondary level is not done well, students suffer and the cause of the institution is undermined. Criticisms of the quality of teaching in today's post-secondary educational institutions are generally aimed at two broad factors. The first is the neglect and the lack of preparation, and the deficiency, secondly, the deficiency of providing practice and preparation for those who are going to assume the role of the professor. The other kind of criticism that I alluded to earlier is the emphasis placed on research and scholarly activity rather than teaching, and that is reflected, generally speaking, in the reward system of our institutions. All of us know a good deal about that these days. Both factors can and are being addressed in many institutions, partly because of public and student demand, and partly because it is clear that the long-range effects of poor teaching bode ill for the future development of disciplined knowledge, for the education of thoughtful graduates capable of assuming leadership roles in society, and for the preparation of scholars and professors who will staff the post-secondary education institutions of the future. Now, definitions of what constitutes good teaching abound. Not surprisingly, it's clear that the ways we think about the teaching task, like the ways we think about the knowledge being taught, have major effects on the nature of teaching that we offer. I refer you again to Parker Palmer's book entitled To Know as We Are Known. In fact, Oliver Osberg mentioned it to me this afternoon and wondered whether I might have read it. I assured him that not only have I read it, but I reread it, and I would commend it to you. It's subtitled A Spirituality of Education. It's the first book I've come across that's tried to address all of the questions associated with education in that kind of context. In that book, Palmer rejects the notion that education is merely the transmittal of information. And of course, I'm sure all of us would do that. But he focuses on ways to engage the whole person in the process of teaching and learning, and on ways to allow room for the consideration and discussion of ultimate concerns. If we place emphasis only on facts, methods, and procedures, he argues, we lose touch with the roots and goals of education. He demonstrates very well that it is possible for students and teachers together to engage in the search for self-knowledge, for shared wisdom, for a profound understanding of the human heart and the nature of the world. And I was very pleased to see that 2 years ago the American Society for Higher Education invited Parker Palmer to be their guest speaker, their keynote speaker. and that his impact on that body was very far-reaching, and you can pick it up in some of the literature that has come out since that time. In fact, in some of Palmer Parker's own, I've got it mixed up around, Palmer's own writing since then, he's argued more specifically that teaching in post-secondary education must not be characterized by that now outmoded emphasis on objectivism that we've talked about a good deal. Attempts to hold the world at arm's length, to dissect it and never put it all together, to manipulate it through experimental techniques in an effort to reshape and to gain control, eventually leads to a concept of persons as objects, and to a sense that persons are spectators rather than players, inextricably engaged in life and learning. And one of our colleagues here today shared with us similar kinds of observations by George Grant in a book that he had along with him this afternoon. And the title of George Grant's book that you were using, perhaps you'd share with this audience as well.
It's The Technology and Justice.
Thank you. George Grant, a scholar who recently died and was at Dalhousie University as well as in other institutions in Canada. Thus, university teaching must address the newer as well as the older epistemologies that recognize relatedness in life, the relatedness between the life of the intellect and the life we all live. And I would suggest that feminist research and the research that is going on in Native Indian studies in Canada today are just two excellent examples of the kinds of criticisms that have been brought to bear on the ways we teach and approach knowledge in post-secondary education. Both feminist studies and Native Indian studies remind us very, very strongly that knowing and learning are communal arts that require a cycle of discussion, of disagreement and consensus, the very essence of what it means to be a community of scholars. And so it's the newer areas of research and thinking that come to inform and remind what must have been the case in the more established disciplines when they were first introduced and debated and argued, and people said, oh, what's all this trivial stuff about? It isn't worth knowing much about it. Writing recently in the Chronicle of Higher Education, a chemistry professor by the name of Sinister, who's at Wittenberg University, tells how he begins his course in teaching chemistry every year by challenging the notion that science is truth. He addresses that topic head on, and that's the dilemma that the Christian church has faced historically when people think that faith and reason are in conflict. Some people have resolved those kinds of tensions by attempting to retain the idea that the ultimacy of both faith and reason can be held to be the case, or by attempting some kind of synthesis of faith and reason and finding ways to accommodate them to one another, or by simply dividing up the territory in which each would have authority. These are the dualisms that we've all read about and that have been historically debated. These dualistic solutions eventually led to a belief in the autonomy of reason with an authority of its own. As people moved to that position, then there was thought to be some kind of gulf fixed between what can be known by reason, what can be known by faith. Now, to avoid such dualisms, Professor Finster deliberately shows how there are multiple perspectives possible in many aspects of science. And in his experience as a teacher in a university, he says, discussing applications of science that both create and solve societal dilemmas provides ample opportunity for examining different perspectives. Good scholars and good teachers always find ways of appreciating knowledge, of living it and breathing it, and of engaging their students in it too. For me, that kind of teaching is part of a Christian worldview. How then can policies in post-secondary education today be formulated to support a community where respect for learning is matched with respect for those who teach and learn? As an administrator in post-secondary education, I'm committed to the concept of academic freedom. But I'm also committed to the understanding that freedom is not license, and that academic freedom, like other freedoms, carries with it the weight of responsibility. Part of that responsibility is to safeguard the freedom to explore ideas, while at the same time ensuring that appropriate criteria for evaluating those ideas are in place. Another part of that responsibility consists in asking two general questions. One, what is being taken for granted in post-secondary education that should be opened up to examination? And two, what is being excluded and why is it being excluded from the realms of scholarship and teaching we customarily take as the domain of post-secondary education? I say that in spite of the fact that in the kind of office I occupy now and as a dean before this, there are tremendous pressures always being put on the curriculum of post-secondary education by every interest group you can imagine that wants another course or another program within the university. So I don't ask those questions lightly, I want to assure you. However, I do ask those questions because I speak from the point of view of one who espouses a Christian worldview, and as one who is responsible by virtue of my office for addressing these questions and engaging others in the same exercise. To do so effectively, I must know and understand the presuppositions I've accepted based on my knowledge of God revealed to me through God the Spirit and God the Son, and appreciate the presuppositions held by others. I must consciously assess the disjunctures I observe between the claims of other worldviews and what I perceive to be a Christian worldview, and be able to provide good grounds for any criticism that I may level at them. Above all, I must pursue the wisdom that transcends the literal mindedness of ordinary thinking and offsets the superficial understanding that Jesus always dismissed for its inadequacy. In John 6:63, Jesus is quoted as saying, "The Spirit gives life. The flesh counts for nothing. The words I have spoken to you are spirit, and they are life." The task of developing a Christian worldview in post-secondary education is ongoing, of course, and requires the efforts of the best minds. Its aim is to bring people to the point where it can be said of us, as it was said of the Apostle Paul by Peter, that he wrote with the wisdom that God gave him. I'm going to close by reading the words of a hymn. I suggested this afternoon that this hymn is contained in the 1936 edition of the Baptist Hymnary, and I haven't been able to find it in any of the editions published since then. And I think that the people who decided not to include it in the hymnary might want to reconsider. The hymn is one by George Rawson, and these are three of the verses. It's hymn number 449, if you want to look it up in the old hymnary in the Wolfville United Baptist Church. We limit not the truth of God to our poor reach of mind by notions of our day and sect, crude, partial, confined. No, let a new and better hope within our hearts be stirred. The Lord hath yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. Who dares to bind to his dull sense the oracles of heaven? For all the nations, tongues, and climes, and all the ages given, that universe, how much unknown, that ocean unexplored. The Lord hath yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. O Father, Son, and Spirit, send us increase from above. Enlarge, expand all Christian souls to comprehend thy love, and make us to go on to know with nobler powers conferred, the Lord hath yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. Thank you.